Jeff Klapes is the recently retired head of reference services at the Lucius Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, Massachusetts, and an avid traveler and photographer. Tonight, the traveling librarian will journey to Transylvania, known for its connection to Vlad Dracul, the real Dracula. This mountainous region of Romania has so much more to offer than a creepy history. Castles, fortified churches, deep forests, and beautiful Baroque towns await the visitor who's willing to explore off the beaten path. It's truly a treat to journey there. I hope you all get a chance, but at least we have Jeff's account. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And please send your questions to the chat.
Thanks, Jess, for the great introduction. And yes, as she mentioned, do feel free as we go through. If you have any questions, put them either in the chat or the Q&A, and either Jess or I will try and keep an eye on that as we go through. And if we miss anything, we'll definitely stay after the program is over. I'll answer any questions at that point as well. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and we will begin. So I hope you can see that. There we go. Okay, this is a trip I took a few years ago, and it started actually in Budapest. We took, you can see on the red line here, we started about a week in Budapest and then took the train into Romania, where we went to the very far north, which is a region called the Maramureș, which not too many people go to, but it's absolutely beautiful. And then we were driving at that point, and then drove down through through the Transylvanian Alps and ended up in Bucharest, the capital, where we spent a couple of days as well. But tonight we're going to focus really on this central area within the mountains. Romania as a whole has about 6 million people. Or I'm sorry, I should say Transylvania has about 6 million people. And it is by far the most touristed part of the country. About 20% of it is ethnically Hungarian, and that's because, as you can see from the geography, Hungary is immediately over the plains to the west, and there has long been a lot of movement between the two countries. So even today, a significant number of Romanian citizens are actually ethnic Hungarians, and many of them speak Hungarian as a first language. Another important ethnic group in the country is the Roma population, which is the term that is the more acceptable term for what the people we used to call gypsies. About 4% of the population is Roma. And although they still do, to a large degree, have a sort of nomadic lifestyle, that's part of why they've been a politically difficult population to deal with, because they don't necessarily have a fixed place to live. But many of them do now have abandoned the nomadic lifestyle and do live in particular locations. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. And of course, a big part of what makes Transylvania so important in people's minds and for tourism is the connection with Dracula, which ever since the novel was published by Bram Stoker in 1897, and he set it in Transylvania, in Romania, the whole area has been connected with that. And of course, over the past century, as popular culture has enjoyed all kinds of different vampire stories, it still goes on 120 some odd years later. Superstition is still pretty widespread in this part of the country. To show you a little bit more about the geography, the biggest thing here is the Carpathian Mountain Range, which is what snakes its way south from the Czech Republic through Slovakia, all the way down into Serbia. The highest peaks in this range are up in Slovakia, but way down here where the Transylvanian Alps go east to west are still extremely high mountains. And if you travel around there, you could very easily think you're in Switzerland. There's a lot of animal life in this area as well. Romania has the largest populations in Europe of larger mammals like bear and wolves and lynx. And a lot of that is just because so much of this region is still relatively wild and undeveloped. So those kinds of animals actually have a habitat that they can still take advantage of. A little bit of quick history. The Saxons play an important role in the history of Transylvania because they came from Germany in the 12th century. They were asked actually by, at the time, the Hungarian king. This was part of the Hungarian Empire at that time. And he needed help to defend the borders. So he invited Saxons to come from the west into what is now Romania to help defend against invasions from the Mongols over the next century and so forth. What they did was they fortified scores of towns in this whole region with fortified churches, castles, forts, and so forth. And 7 of the most important cities, the ones that you can see starred here, gave their name to the region at the time, which in German was called the Siebenbürgen, meaning the 7 cities. And you can see in this little box the original German names, and in parentheses the names that are now used in Romania. We're going to visit several of them as we go through, because they are still today very important cities and very beautiful. Not surprisingly, the German population has declined significantly in Romania since World War II, because many people with German roots whose ancestry goes back to the Saxons centuries ago, many of them have relocated back to Germany or to Austria. So there just aren't as many of them as there used to be, but the historical importance is still there. These photos just give you a quick view of what it kind of looks like there. It's a very beautiful mountainous plateau amongst the Carpathian range. The name Transylvania, of course, means trans meaning across and Sylvania meaning forest. It's the land across the forest. So it's over the mountains, across the forest in this completely enclosed area, significantly higher elevation than the rest of the country. I'm going to start in Bistrița, which has a very strong connection to the Dracula story. This is the Hotel Castel Dracula, which is at the top of the Borgo Pass. It looks cheesy because it is. It is the traditional site where Bram Stoker set his fictional castle. And it's important to note that Bram Stoker never once set foot in Romania, so he actually didn't know anything about what he was talking about other than what he had heard and read. But this particular town is a real place, and he set the castle of his fictional Dracula at the top of the mountain, the mountain pass. And so in the 1970s, under the dictator Ceausescu, they decided to try to encourage tourism related to vampires and so forth. And they built this rather unsuccessful pastiche of historic castle and modern hotel. We decided to stay in it just for fun. You should visit their website because it's incredibly tacky and has flying bats and blood dripping and all of that. So if you can put aside the tackiness of the tourist aspect of it, the nice part of it is that it's an absolutely gorgeous setting. And if you are reading Dracula, which I reread the story while I was there, and it does give you a real feel for the atmosphere that Stoker was trying to convey. Here's a monument to him. But it's a beautiful setting at the top of this mountain pass where you can see in all directions over the mountains. Here's our room. And again, it's a very tacky place, so it's lit up blood red at night. We only stayed one night just because we felt we had to. Here I am pretending to be Dracula in our hotel room. It's still a reasonably popular place even today, and it isn't terribly expensive. Nothing in Romania is terribly expensive. I can't say the food was all that inspired at the hotel. They even had something called crud pancake, which I did not order, so I can't actually tell you what it is. But here we are the following morning, just enjoying the mist And you can see the sheep and cows and so forth. Romania is very rural. Once you get out of the main towns, one of the joys of traveling in Romania is enjoying just how traditional rural life is still very much alive there. Part of that is unfortunate because in some ways it's that the development of Romania lags behind by several decades. But on the other hand, they've made a lot of they've taken advantage of that because it's a way of attracting tourists to see a little bit of what Eastern Europe might have really been like a few decades ago. The town that's closest to the castle here, and in fact, right at the bottom of where you start to go up the pass, is called Bistrița, and it is one of the 7 towns that I mentioned earlier. It's pretty good size, about 70,000 people, and it does figure in Bram Stoker's novel. This is the Evangelical Lutheran Church, built in the 14th century and then remodeled after that. It's a pretty town. There's not a whole lot to do. But it's a lovely place to stop. As we head south, I'm going to work my way through south towards the Alps and visit some of the other 7 cities. And you'll see how they are very similar in some ways and also very different. This is one called Târgu Mureș, which is another old market town. In fact, the name means market on the Mureș River. It's actually a quite large town, about 200,000 people. And it has the largest Hungarian population in all of Romania. About 1 out of every 4 people in Târgu Mureș is Hungarian. And they also, as much of the rest of Transylvania, also have a fairly large Roma population, about 3–4% of the whole town. It's a gorgeous town with an interesting mix of Baroque architecture and also a lot of Art Nouveau, which was a surprise to me. Here's just some street scenes. There's some beautiful public buildings there. This is the Cultural Palace, which is an Art Nouveau art center, essentially, that was built in 1911 at the height of the craze of Art Nouveau style. And it's now used for a museum. There's a public library there. They have a concert hall and all kinds of public arts events there, but you can see the architectural detail is beautiful, and you can go inside and see some of the interior as well. Târgu Mureș is a town you've probably never heard of. Even if you look at travel guides to Romania, it will certainly not be one of the top places to visit. But what I really loved about traveling in Romania was that there were so many places like this that if they were in Western Europe, they would be incredibly popular places for people to visit. And in Romania, they're largely unknown, and you will very likely be almost alone as foreign tourists. This is another of the municipal buildings, also in Art Nouveau style, and the big public square. They were having a bicycle festival while we were there. And mixed in are all these other kinds of old medieval style buildings, Renaissance style buildings. This is the next town kind of along that route as we head south towards the mountains. It's a little more touristy and more popular. It's called Sighișoara. Maybe 25,000 people, so it's kind of Chelmsford sized. But it's a very important fortified Saxon market town, like Târgu Mureș, founded in the 12th century when all the Saxons came over and built lots of guild towers and very nice, elaborate burghers' houses for the wealthy merchants. It's a UNESCO site now, protected UNESCO heritage site, because it is one of the best medieval cities, best preserved medieval cities in all of Europe, east or west. You can see kind of tucked in the back, there's a tower, bell tower, and there's a citadel located on a big bluff, which I'll show you in a second. And then down below is the newer town outside the original medieval walls, which has a lot of beautiful buildings in it. Here we are in our rental car, squeezing our way down an extremely narrow street to our guest house, which looked like this inside. I mentioned I was rereading Dracula. I had read it years ago, and it was fun to reread it again while I was in the place where a lot of the action is supposed to take place. And so we stayed in this wonderful bed and breakfast guest house. And there was a tremendous thunder and lightning storm while we were there. So it was just perfect to be in this big wooden bed in a medieval building, reading Dracula while thunder and lightning was going on outside. But still very comfortable. I should point out that a lot of people think that traveling in Romania would be very rustic and there's not a lot of tourist infrastructure, and that's not really true. It's a very inexpensive place to travel, but there are lots and lots of perfectly nice hotels, very comfortable with all the modern conveniences that you'd expect. And there aren't a lot of big international style hotels. Personally, I prefer that because I would much rather stay in an old-fashioned guest house that's in a medieval building or something like that. And it's just a nicer environment. This is looking from our window out over the roofs of the town up to the citadel up on the hill. Unfortunately, it was kind of rainy the day we were there, but Transylvania in bad weather is still just as atmospheric because that's kind of what you think of. This is the 13th century clock tower that you could see in the background of that other photo. It's 200 feet high and has a nice, has one of those mechanical clocks in it that still works. And just some scenes of the streets around Sighișoara. If the weather had been nicer and it were summer, this would be mobbed with people. Because of its connection with Dracula, there's a lot of tourist shops and cafes and restaurants and so forth. So it was actually, despite the weather, it was kind of good for us because it was not anywhere near as crowded as it might be at other times of year. This is one of the 9 surviving fortification towers. All the way around the original medieval walls. These towers were built by different burghers' guilds and funded by them in order to protect the town. But much of what you're seeing here is very Baroque style architecture, mostly from like the 17th and 18th centuries. But a lot of it has been beautifully restored, and most of the upper town, the historic part of the town, is completely pedestrianized. So it's a lovely place to walk around, even in the rain. Here's the main square. And of course, part of why it's so touristy is the connection with the real historical Dracula. In this house, what this little plaque is saying is that in this house, between the years of 1431 and 1435, the Romanian ruler named Vlad Dracul lived here. This is actually not Dracula. This is his father. The Dracula that we now know of, the historical Dracula, was known as Vlad Tepes. And this is his father, who lived here during this time period. And in theory, this is the birthplace of Vlad the Impaler, his son. His father was given the name Dracul because he was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was created by King Sigismund at the time. It was a military order for security purposes, and they took the name Dragon, which in Romanian is Dracul. So that's where all that comes from. We're going to talk much more about Vlad Tepes a little bit later when we get to some areas that are more connected with him as an adult. Here are just some more scenes around the town, including this amazing covered stairway, which goes from the main square all the way up to the big church on the hill. And this was built in the 1600s to protect people in the winter, because the weather climbing up the hill could be very cold in Transylvania in the winter. It's the elevation is high, it gets very cold and very snowy. So this was a way of allowing people to go to church without being frozen to death. When you get to the top, there's this gorgeous church, which is kind of creepy in the mist. It was built as a Catholic church. Many churches in Transylvania were originally built as Catholic churches. But during the Reformation, a number of them, including this one, were converted to Lutheranism. during the Reformation in the 1540s. And behind it, there's this really beautiful atmospheric cemetery, Lutheran cemetery, which you can't really see in this photograph because the print is too small, but many of these graves are actually German names, because so many of the people in Sigishwara over the centuries had German ancestry. This is another one of those gill towers protecting the town. I loved this particular building that just has this unusual painting on the corner where they've actually included a carving of a stag with antlers built into the side of the building. In the lower town, you find a very different kind of architecture, much of which was built much later, outside the original medieval wall. So there's a lot of Art Nouveau and Victorian style architecture. And it's not as pedestrianized and is much more busy, but it's still a beautiful town. And if you are ever traveling in this area, it's definitely one of the no miss towns that you should absolutely stop to visit. And it makes a good base for visiting the surrounding area. This was just somebody's garage door. I love the bright colors. The area around Sigishwara has a number of beautiful towns off in the countryside. This is one of the better known ones called Birtan. And it's, if you remember earlier, I mentioned the many, many towns that when the Saxons came into this area, they fortified a lot of these towns. Not just the big cities, but a lot of the smaller communities in the countryside as well. And this is one of the best preserved ones, with a fortified church that you can see off in the distance. This is what the surrounding countryside looks like. Lots of rolling hills and a lot of agriculture. This is a very typical look of a smaller Romanian rural community. Here we are using the ATM, which for some reason was elevated several steps above the sidewalk. But the highlight of Birtan is the church, of course. It is one of the largest in Transylvania, and was originally the seat of the Lutheran Bishop of Transylvania. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important. The building that you see here dates from the early 16th century. And it may look a little bit like a castle, more than a church, and obviously that's very deliberate. The whole point was that in the event of a siege, an attack by the Mongols or whoever it might have been, the entire population of the village would have been able to shelter and withstand a siege inside the fortification of the church. This is the interior of the church, which is extremely beautiful, with this gorgeous altarpiece with all these different paintings on it. But outside the church, there's bastions that have these protective towers, 7 of them, in fact. And this is the view from up high, looking out over the lower town and to the surrounding area. There are a number of towns like this throughout Transylvania, but I think Birtan is, if you were only going to visit one, this is one of the better ones to see, because the church is so noteworthy and is an excellent example of this kind of architecture. There's also a nice museum there that has historic furnishings and so forth, talking about the history of the town and the history of Saxons in Germany and in Romania and so forth. And just some more scenes around the village. You can see how the church just looms over everything below it. Something that's worth pointing out about Romania, and I mentioned it earlier, is just how rural it is. And because of that, you will see a lot of active rural life going on. If you read guidebooks, they'll talk about how dangerous the driving is in Romania, and I didn't really find it that much. Of course, I drive in Boston, but you will see an awful lot of stuff in the roads, like tractors or carriages being pulled by cattle or oxen or horses or donkeys. There are dogs sleeping in the road. There are logs. There are sheep. There are farmers walking with implements, you name it. So you do have to kind of be a bit careful as you're driving around. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A that I will just try to answer as we're going through here. Someone was asking if there are ethnic tensions. Absolutely, yes. Not so much between Romanians and Hungarians, but the biggest problem is probably the Roma, because as in many other parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, that kind of ethnic group are victims of an awful lot of prejudice. Some of that is from the regular, the rest of the population. Some of it is by officials. You will find problems with the police, and the Roma population definitely is less educated, economically dealing with far more problems, has less access to healthcare, less access to jobs, and so on and so forth. And they certainly experience a lot of prejudice in the country. That can depend on where you are and the degree to which their presence is visible. But that obviously doesn't affect tourism in any way, but you will see that as particularly in the larger towns. I did not notice and have not heard anything about particular problems between ethnic Hungarians and ethnic Romanians because they've lived there together for so long. Things in Hungary now are a little bit different with Viktor Orban there, and Hungary has, at least officially, at the government level, taken a hard turn to the right. So that may be creating a little more tension with Romania. But I don't know enough about that to say anything right now. The thing that you're most likely to notice is the Roma, absolutely. Someone also asked if Transylvania is expensive. Generally, no. I think it can be if you want to spend a ton of money, but no, you can easily find any number of accommodations, restaurants that are going to be considerably cheaper than traveling anywhere else in Western Europe and even in Eastern Europe. Many of, like the hotel that I showed you that had the beautiful 4-poster bed in a very popular touristy town, I don't think that was more than $100 US for a huge room with a private bathroom and a full breakfast. That's in most of the places we stayed were even cheaper than that. So I think if you're looking for a relatively inexpensive place to travel in Europe, Romania is a great place to try because they have all of the comforts I think that you would want, at least if you're a reasonably accommodating traveler who doesn't need a Hilton every time you stay at night. I think you'll find no problems in Romania, and it'll probably cost you half of what it would cost to travel around, say, Spain or France. Let's see, moving on. Here's just some more, again, more pictures of the locals. I'm going to quickly zip through another one of the big towns, again, dating from the 13th century. This is a little bit smaller, about 50,000 people, called Mediaș. And it is another of the old market towns, but these days it's much more important because it is very close to a number of big natural gas fields in the area. And I think all of us are paying a lot more attention to where things like oil and natural gas come from one country to the other than we were a year ago. So that's certainly an important part of the Romanian economy, is being an energy producer to some degree. This is not one of the more important towns to visit, but it was still a very nice place to stop. We just had lunch there. I enjoyed this. This photograph is actually a bus station, a bus stop. You can see the bus map in the back, but it's been artfully decorated just for fun. Another very pretty Baroque style town. I took this photo only because this orange shop is completely blue, as you can see. I just thought that was funny. Orange, for those of you who've traveled in Europe, Orange is actually a telecom company from France. A little further down the road, again, bear in mind, we're still working our way slowly south through the plateau towards the Transylvanian Alps. This one is called Kopča. And this is a smelting works that you can see going back about 100 years ago. It's now owned by a company from Greece, interestingly, that's installing filters to bring it up to EU standards. A big problem that Romania has had over the past century is real problems with the environment. In this particular town, just as an example, the soil has 92 times the permitted level of lead. And plants that grow there have 22 times the permitted level of lead. So you can't eat them. There's all these kinds of leftover problems from the days when Romania was under the Soviet umbrella. And there was an intense need to create manufacturing and industry, and the environment be damned. And of course, significant health effects are still happening decades later and have been documented. This whole area around this particular town, most of the houses have now been cleaned, but they used to be completely black because of the pollution. So it's kind of a sad situation. But Romania has, now that Romania is part of the EU, and they are an EU member, although they don't use the euro yet. Romania has definitely made big strides over the last 20 years or so. And you'd see that a lot if you travel there. This is probably one of the biggest towns in the area, called Sibiu, a very good sized city with about 150,000 people. And it's a decade or so ago, it was in fact made the European City of Culture, which is something Europe does every year to highlight a particular community and promote tourism and travel. It was probably the most important of those 7 Saxon towns back in medieval times. It's still an important town. In fact, a few years ago, the mayor of Sibiu was elected president of Romania for a while. He's no longer in power. And it's another one of those cities that has a medieval core with a lot of guild towers around it that were built for protection by the different guilds, medieval guilds. This is the guest house that we stayed in. Nice little side street. And again, this is a good example of the kind of place you can stay in if you travel there, with perfectly comfortable private bathroom, delicious, sumptuous breakfasts. Romanian food, as you might guess, is filling. It's a meat and potatoes kind of country. But an advantage is that most of those meat and potatoes are very local. So the food is delicious and locally prepared. Sibiu is a beautiful town to explore. This is called the Bridge of Liars. You go under that to get into the city from the north. It was the very first iron bridge ever built in Romania. There are various unconfirmed legends about its name. Like if you cross it and you are a liar, you'll die or something like that. But of course, they're all just stories. The town, like many of the others we've seen, is divided into an upper and a lower town. The upper town has 2 very big squares, which are better seen here. And this is a Google Maps shot, so you can see the smaller square and the larger square with all the big churches and civic buildings around it. The 2 squares are divided by this medieval council tower, which is now a museum. And so you can go up to the top and get great views out over the whole city. Sibiu has a lot of cultural stuff going on in it. In fact, they were just taking down a lot of gates and set up for a concert series that they had when we were there. This is the Lutheran Cathedral with one of the largest organs in all of Europe. The four towers that you see up here, you wouldn't know, but that actually was a very important signal in the Middle Ages. Cities that had that kind of design in their church towers signified to anyone who was approaching the town from outside that it was a city that used the death penalty as part of their justice system. So you knew before you even set foot in the city that that was a possibility. I'm assuming at this point you're starting to see a theme in the architecture, because much of it does have that very Eastern European feel. There's a lot of stucco, there's a lot of the terracotta tile roofs. This is a museum about Saxon history in Sibiu that has this beautiful arcade. And there are lots of really nice little side streets to explore. Sibiu has a very lively arts scene and also a foodie scene. It's an excellent base if you wanted to stay a few nights and take day trips. Sibiu is an excellent location for that because of the accommodations and the hotels and services, and the fact that it's very centrally located to a lot of the places that you might want to visit. This is the Orthodox Cathedral, much more recent. It was in fact built in 1902. And it's in a very Byzantine style. There is an Orthodox population in Transylvania, not huge, but it exists. And this is the mother church for Romanian Orthodox people. The country is a mix of Romanian Orthodox, Catholic, Lutheran, variety of things, and it kind of depends on where you are in the country, which one predominates. This is the interior, which was specifically designed to recall Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and it certainly does. In addition to that kind of building, there's, like the other cities we've seen, there's a lot of Art Nouveau, excellent example here, and lots of nice pedestrian streets. This photo is an example of the local police hassling a member of the Roma population, like I mentioned, minding his own business, but this is not an uncommon sight in some parts of Romania, even today. And this is another religion, the Roman Catholic Basilica. Built much later, you can see this was probably more an 18th century style building, and very Catholic in style inside. Here's the pulpit. And the little square with a little nicer weather. This is the view I was mentioning. If you go up to the top of that clock tower, you can see all the way out over the city. If the weather had cooperated a little bit more, you would off in the distance see the Transylvanian Alps quite clearly. They aren't actually that far away. You see a little bit of them beginning here. These are the foothills off in the distance. Some more interesting Art Nouveau. And you really need to walk around at night. It's another of those cities that just turns on all the floodlights. And there's so many beautiful civic buildings, churches, and public squares that it's a delight to stroll around after dinner and enjoy the lights. A good day trip from here, if you have a chance, is this mammoth castle. It's in a town that you wouldn't otherwise want to visit. There's not really much there, in a town called Hunedoara. And this is called Corvin Castle. Hunedoara is a pretty dreary kind of place. The only reason you would want to go there is to see this castle. It's also known as Hunyadi Castle. Back when this was still part of the Hungarian Empire, King Sigismund gave this site to the father of John Hunyadi, and then later on, the son John constructed a castle here in the mid-1400s. He didn't live very long. He died not long after he started construction. His wife lived on after him and added a lot more Renaissance features, like the kinds of things that you can see here. Supposedly, John Hunyadi imprisoned Vlad the Impaler here for several years. That's part of the degree to which that's historically accurate is kind of hard to say for sure, but it's definitely part of the lore. And John's son was very important. His name was Matthias Corvinus. Corvinus being Latin for crow. You'll see crows, in fact, in a lot of places in the castle. And he was king of Hungary for quite a long time and one of the best known kings of Hungary. It's a fantastic spot to visit, particularly if you're ever traveling there with children, because it's a picture perfect castle, and they pretty much let you explore anywhere you want to go. And it has this fantastic moat and drawbridge, and then inside, it's been pretty well restored. So it gives you a reasonably good idea of what it might have been like to live in a castle like this in, say, the 14th century or 15th century. It surrounds a central courtyard, and different parts of the building were built at different times. Here, they were working on some additional restoration of the Renaissance wing here. Here's the chapel on the inside. And there's lots of turrets and walkways to climb on, and you get great views out over the countryside. It's huge. You could easily spend 2-3 hours there, and if you had a little more time and the weather cooperated a little bit more, there's some grounds outside that you can explore as well. Here you can see some examples. These are downspouts in the form of sort of mythological creatures that are sort of a mix of crows and dragons and bats. I like this woman. I took several pictures of this woman who was, she was a tourist visiting the place just like we were, but I loved her outfit, and I kind of assumed she was Roma for a while, given her general look. And then at some point I figured out from overhearing her that she was just a German tourist on vacation. I'm almost glad we were there on a cloudy day, because I think if it were gloriously sunny with a blue sky, it wouldn't have quite the same effect. This is a castle that I think Vlad the Impaler should have lived here, even if he didn't. It clearly has his style marked on it. The area around here doesn't have a whole lot to do, but it has some beautiful countryside to explore with a lot of little villages that are just very typical of the area. This one's called Sibiel, not Sibiu, but Sibiel. And here's a typical village church with interesting paintings on it. A lot of the places that we went, I was surprised to see how many churches had paintings on the exterior of the building exposed to the elements. Again, very typical look to the villages. Most of the towns have, the houses are actually very long and narrow, and are lined up along the road, with the narrow part of the house facing the street. And then in the back, they have gardens and room for livestock and so forth. This same little town, Sibiel, has a tradition of painting icons Orthodox icons on glass. So now inside the church, there's a little museum where you can see examples of how they do that. Here's a good close-up of that. And again, this is an area where if you're driving around here and trying to visit, you would find you might very well be the only people in these villages. This one is called Tilishka, a small village of about 1,500 people way up in the valleys, kind of tucked in the foothills in a valley in between them. I'm quickly checking some of the chat to see what I might have missed, if I can answer anything. What type of government? Romania has a representative democracy. They've had a number of not major crises, but there's been some there's been some corruption scandals in recent years, but nothing that has erupted into major problems. It's certainly it's very similar to a lot of the other Eastern European nations in that respect. You don't need to speak Romanian to get by as a tourist, although knowing a little bit of it would help. Romanian, if you know any other Romance languages, French, Italian, or Spanish, Romanian sounds a lot different, but you will probably recognize a lot of things on signage and menus and so forth. If you're way out in the rural areas, English is not terribly widely spoken, but so a few basic phrases, please, thank you, that kind of thing will help. But we managed perfectly well with nothing but a Romanian phrase book and waving our arms and that kind of thing. And certainly if you're spending most of your time in the larger towns, English is definitely widely spoken because it's the primary lingua franca for any kind of tourist who would be visiting there from whatever country. We were there in the fall. I want to say it was October that we were late September or October that we were there. Someone was asking, oh, someone also asked about not eating any of the plants. That comment I made about the plants that had been poisoned because of industry was specific to that one small town, not Romania as a whole. So you can certainly eat vegetables and other things that are grown all over the country. It was only that one specific place that I was referring to. Did I feel safe there? Oh, absolutely. Romania is definitely it's as safe as traveling anywhere else in Europe, let's put it that way. The people are incredibly friendly. There's not a lot of mass tourism, and I think that helps because if you're traveling there, you're not a very common kind of person if you're traveling there. They don't see many Americans. It's mostly other Europeans. So they are very welcoming to anyone that they find. At least that was my experience. Crime, beyond the normal kinds of crime that you would need to be concerned about traveling anywhere, just being aware of pickpocketing and not leaving your valuables out where you can see them. Violent crime against tourists is just not really a thing. As I said, I think the biggest danger would be running into a cow if you're driving at night on a dark road. So I would definitely not be concerned about safety there. Yes, we rented a car while we were there. We took the train from Budapest and then rented a car once we arrived in Romania. Someone's asking about who the knight is on top of the tower and of the castle. I don't know. I would have to look that up. My guess is it's probably a representation of someone like Matthias Corvin. And my guess is that those decorations are probably much later additions to the castle, but I don't know for sure. I'd have to check on that. Moving south, again, we are heading now into the highest mountains where the Transylvanian plain meets the foothills of the Transylvanian Alps. And we drove over that. There's only a couple of places where you can actually drive over the Alps. And the best one, if you have the chance, is the Transfagarash Highway. It's the second highest mountain pass accessible by car, at least, anywhere in Europe. And it was built in the 1970s, mostly by the military under Ceausescu, the dictator. Originally built for military purposes to be able to transport things over the mountains. The official records say that 40 people died during its construction, in construction accidents and so forth. Probably the real count is higher than that, but it's an amazing engineering feat because of how it winds through these incredibly high alpine landscapes. It gets into much denser forest. This is the forest where, as I mentioned at the beginning, the kinds of animals like bears and even ibex and other kinds of pretty rare mammals, they would be most likely to be seen here, although the likelihood of you seeing any of them is still very slim because they would stay away from humans. Here's a map of what it looks like. There's a nice twizzly road that works its way up, up and over the highest mountains, and then you come down this gorgeous valley into a reservoir. This is an artificial reservoir created by a dam. But this road, which takes 2 or 3 hours to travel, is one of the best road trips anywhere in Europe, I think. And you can see from here just the incredibly dramatic landscape. You might run into a lot of this. Logging is big in this part of Romania. And even though it was probably in the 60s and low 70s, down in Sibiu, when you get high up into the mountains in October, there's plenty of snow. And in the winter, in fact, the road closes sometime during November, depending on weather. Eventually, it just gets completely snowed in, and it's not accessible for several months of the year. But the scenery from up here is really quite spectacular. You don't need any kind of special vehicle as long as the road is open. You know, we were just driving a tiny little rental car. You don't need a 4x4 or anything like that, as long as the road has been plowed, which it was when we were there. But you can see the road that goes down the valley all the way back, way down in the distance. You can kind of see it's actually sunny back in Sibiu, where we were in the morning. You could easily be in Switzerland, Austria, any number of other gorgeous alpine locations. Here we are proving that we were there. And as you drive back down the other side, so now we're on the south side of the Alps, a very quick descent brings you back down into the pine forest. And you can feel the temperature going higher and higher the further down you go. And so by the time we got to the bottom, it was 75 and sunny and beautiful summery weather with the mountain peaks high up above us in the distance. This is called Lake Vidraru. The reservoir that I was mentioning was created in the 1960s by damming the Argeș River. There were a number of villages that were actually submerged, kind of like the Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts. But it's a very pretty drive along the coastline. Here's the dam at the southern end of it. And because it was so sunny, there were a bunch of dogs just enjoying the pleasant fall weather. And there's this interesting monument here. This is called the statue of Prometheus. Prometheus being the Greek Titan who, against the will of Zeus, brought fire to human beings and got himself punished for it. But here's a statue of him. It's called Electro Man, actually, but it's supposed to represent Prometheus bringing light. And of course, it's here because this is a hydroelectric dam that brings power to this part of Romania. But it's a beautiful rural area. We're actually technically no longer in Transylvania now because we've crossed the Alps onto the south side. So we're in Wallachia on the south side of the Carpathian Mountains. But again, just beautiful, beautiful scenery. A local by the side of the road selling crafts. There's a lot of wonderful crafts, particularly textiles. If you're interested in textiles, there's lots of that in Romania. So I'm showing you this not because this is technically not Transylvania, but I wanted you to get a little sense of what the landscape around this area looks like. But we're going to curve back around now and head back north over the mountains into Transylvania. And we're going to stop at probably the most visited thing in the entire country. This is Bran Castle, built in the 13th century, although most of the building that you see now and that you can visit now dates from considerably later. And in fact, it was totally renovated in the 1920s when it became a royal residence for Queen Marie. And then after she died, it went to her daughter, and then to the Communist Party. And then in 2005, it went back to the original heirs. It's had a long history. So there was a lot of legal back and forth. But at this point, it is still in the family. And in fact, when we were there, I'm not sure the status of it now. It was for sale. So if you have several tens of millions of dollars, you could buy it and run it yourself if you're interested. It is now a museum and definitely one of the most visited sites in all of Romania. And part of that is because it's just very beautiful and an easy day trip from the capital, but also because of its supposed connection to Dracula. The thing that's important to emphasize here, though, and I don't think it really detracts from visiting the place, is that there's almost no connection to Dracula. It is constantly advertised as Dracula's castle, but the most that really connects the real Vlad Tepes there, Vlad the Impaler, is that he might have stayed there a couple of nights after he got captured on his way to Hungary, where he supposedly stayed also at the other castle that we just visited. He also, at some point before he got captured, laid siege to this, to Bran Castle at one point. But there was never a point anywhere in its history where he owned it or lived in it or anything. So I think it's mainly because it just, it's a way of taking advantage of the tourist connection. However, it is still an absolutely beautiful spot to visit. It's a gorgeous building. The location is magnificent because it's nestled in the foothills of the high mountains. And the interiors are stunning because they were all completely redesigned by Queen Marie in traditional Romanian folk design in the 1920s. And it's another building where you can visit most of it. There are, you don't have to take an organized tour, and you can explore most of the rooms on several floors, all the way up to the top where there are fantastic views out over the surrounding countryside. There are lots of beautiful little inner courtyards. And it's fairly well furnished, unlike some of the other castles that we visited, because it was so recently remodeled in the 20th century. This is actually the room where Queen Marie's bedroom. Marie was an interesting character, and there are some interesting biographies of her. If you're curious to know more about her, she was kind of, she was not Romanian, first of all. She was, in fact, I believe, distantly related to Queen Victoria, in England, but she married into the Romanian royal family and became a champion of Romanian identity and politics and culture. And so when she took over the castle, she completely remodeled the inside to make it more livable in a modern 20th century, 1920s sense, and filled it full of furnishings, decorative arts, textiles, ceramics, and so forth that represented the traditions of the Romanian people. And for that, she was very beloved by the people of the country. She was incredibly famous in her day in a way that I don't think we would really understand right now. Probably the best comparison I could make is she was kind of like the Princess Diana of her time. Everybody from every country knew her. She was a queen of a relatively backwater Eastern European nation, but she fought very hard to get Romania to the table, to the negotiation table in World War I and or after World War I. And she really did her best to bring attention to the country, to the world at large. And she did that by traveling. She traveled to the United States, and she attracted enormous crowds everywhere that she went. She wasn't a traditional beauty, but she was very attractive, and she made the most of it. And so I would recommend reading about her, just because she's such a fascinating person from a time before the modern media. Today she would be an Instagram influencer and she would have millions of followers. But it's a very interesting story. This is her drawing room. I kind of like this castle because it's not overwhelming. This isn't like visiting Versailles in Paris or a place like that. The sizes of the rooms are actually fairly small and intimate, even though there's an awful lot of them. The stairway here is actually a secret staircase that goes all the way from the first floor to the third floor, and was discovered during the renovations in between the wars. Here you can see that staircase. But you also can get a sense of the folk design here. This is the largest room in the castle, and it served as a music room and a library. There's a fireplace in here with an ingle nook where you can sit and curl up by the fire with a book. And there are lots of very nice terraces and balconies up high where you can get views out over the countryside. This is the terrace on the very top floor of the castle outside Prince Nikolai's apartment. I don't think I can accurately recreate all of the scandal of their family because it's very convoluted. Nikolai was the second son. Prince Carol, Carol being the Romanian version of Charles, was the heir apparent, but he renounced his throne. He was kind of a playboy. And so then the youngest son, Michael, became the king, but he was too young, so it was a regency. And then Nikolai, who had been out of the country, abandoned his career in the British Royal Navy to come home. But that didn't work out because Carol came back after gallivanting around Europe. And he, being the oldest brother, he gave his consent that to Nikolai's marriage, because Nikolai wanted to marry a divorcee, which was not acceptable in those days. But then after telling him he could do that, he used it as an excuse to deprive him of all of his royal rights and kicked him out of the country, where he eventually died in Spain in the 1970s. So it's a very long, convoluted story. And it's just kind of it's kind of interesting to think we spend so much time focusing on the British royal family, and occasionally the royals of Monaco or other places, but the history of the Romanian royalty is a rollicking good ride. So if there are a number of books that you can probably find in the Chelmsford Library or other area libraries to read about Marie and the history of this time period. Again, more views from and of the castle. This was Prince Nikolai's drawing room, very cozy with a view out over the central courtyard. So you can kind of see why it's such a popular place to visit. It is an easy day trip from, well, maybe a long day trip. It takes a good probably 2 hours to get there from Bucharest, but that's a manageable day trip. There are all kinds of bus tours that will take you there. You can take the train actually to get there, or you could take an organized bus tour. There are many tours that will do an overnight because there's other things to see in this area as well. So if you don't have your own car, but you're in Bucharest, you could make a weekend of it and see several of the other beautiful things in this area. Here's a tea house at the bottom of the hill. The castle's built on the top of this hill. And there was actually a dumbwaiter that ran by cable from the castle all the way down here that carried food and drink up and down. Here's Bran Village, which has about 6,000 people in it and has really built up around the castle. It's incredibly touristy. You can buy all kinds of t-shirts, crafts, some nice, some tacky, and of course, tons and tons and tons of Dracula stuff. If you want anything related to vampires and Dracula, you can buy it here. But there's plenty of other castles to see too. Here's another citadel called Rashnov, which, if you didn't know, you can easily see by the giant letters on the mountain. Another 13th century castle built by the Saxons, now a museum that you can visit. And we're going to finish up the program in another of the main towns, another one of those 7 cities called Brasov. It's not far from Brancaster, and it's another place where it's a relatively easy trip from Bucharest because it's the first major thing that you get when you cross the mountains. It's about 250,000 people, but unlike some of the other places we've visited, whereas this is very far to the southeast, this is almost entirely Romanian. There's a small Hungarian population, maybe 5–7%. But nowhere near as much as the cities that you get the closer you get to the Hungarian border. It's also a major industrial area in addition to being a tourist hub. The outskirts have on the plain, just north of it, it's a big manufacturing and industrial area. But the old town where you can see the central square here is very beautifully restored. In fact, it's so nicely restored that it was one of the filming locations for some of the Harry Potter films, where they needed very traditional, old-fashioned townscapes. Some of that was actually filmed here in Brasov. We were lucky to have very nice weather when we were there, so the sun was out. Take note, because I'm going to take you up here in a minute, way up on the hills. It is surrounded on 3 sides by very high hills. And you can take a funicular or hike up the mountains to get a great view from up the top. The central plaza has cafes, very typical European plaza. This was our hotel here, and it was originally a bank building from the 15th century that's been converted into a very nice hotel in a perfect spot because it's walking distance to everything in the old town. There's a mix of Gothic buildings, Renaissance buildings, Baroque buildings, Art Nouveau buildings. I think of all the towns I've shown you, of all the 7 of the Siebenbürgen, Brasov is probably the most beautiful overall. Here's a view of it from up top, where if you get to the top, either by hiking through the woods or taking the funicular, there's a gorgeous view down to the town where you can see all the terracotta roof houses and the streets and the churches, as well as the surrounding countryside. Here they were setting up for a market day one of the days we were there. Brasov is also another great location for you to use as a base for exploration. There's more than enough to do in Brasov to keep you amused for several days, but it's very convenient to a lot of the other places that we've been, either by car or by train, and to some of the countryside in the mountains. So it's a good place to plunk yourself down for a few days. Here we are way up at the top, behind the sign, where you can see these views and take selfies. The rocky outcropping that you see here was actually a citadel. There's almost nothing left of it except a few foundation stones. But Vlad the Impaler attacked Brasov and destroyed the citadel that was on this hilltop where we stand now in the mid 1400s, around 1460. And in order to make clear that you weren't supposed to mess with him, he impaled. He was known for, that's why he got the name, for impaling his captives. So he took 40 of the wealthy merchants of the town and impaled them up here on the mountain where everyone could see them. He did, if you're interested in knowing the details, I'll give you the brief version, which is that usually while they were still alive, he would take either a steel or a wooden rod and basically impale you up your backside, through your innards and out through your mouth, while you were still alive, and then lift you upright and leave you there until you died. So it was quite an unpleasant way to die. And he was not the only person to do this, and he was certainly not, back in his day, he was not the only appalling, violent chieftain in this part of the world, but he certainly has become the most notorious and best known in history. You can see here the old town, but as it spills out into the suburbs north into the Transylvanian plain. Brasov is a gorgeous town to stroll around. The buildings, there are a lot of pedestrianized streets and just incredible detail. This is the old town hall from the 13th century that has a clock, and the symbol of the city here, which is a crown growing out of the roots of an oak tree, symbolizing stability. Brasov in the old German, when it was a Saxon town, was known as Kronberg, crown city, in other words. And that's why the symbol is still used today. The central plaza is the focus of the city, but there's all kinds of wonderful little side streets to explore. And a lot of, there's some good museums and also some amazing churches. This one is Romania's largest Gothic church. It's called the Black Church. It has a 7-ton bell that, if you're lucky, you might get to hear, and was built in the late 14th, early 15th century. And it's been damaged and restored several times. The name comes from a lot of fire damage that it suffered in the 17th century, which has since been mostly cleaned off. But for a while, it was blackened by soot, and that's how it got its name. Here's a statue of a gentleman named Johannes Hunter, who was a native of the city. He was a famous theologian in the 15th century and also a famous humanist and a map maker. And he traveled around Europe and eventually returned to Transylvania in the early 1500s and helped to introduce and spread Lutheranism throughout the area. This is an unfortunately unfocused photograph because you weren't technically supposed to take pictures of the church. But I wanted you to see the number of Turkish carpets that are arrayed along the walls in the back. You'll see these in a lot of Transylvanian churches. These were originally Protestant churches because of the Saxon presence. And they used these carpets as decoration instead of the elaborate Baroque kind of Catholic decorations that are so typical of Catholic churches. There was actually quite a bit of trade between Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire and the locals in this area. So rich parishioners would often donate or bequeath these kinds of luxurious carpets to the church. This particular church, the Black Church, has over 100 of those hanging along the walls. This is an Orthodox church just outside the walls. It's an old church, but more recently redesigned in the 18th century. But I loved it because it's so slender, very different from a lot of the churches that we've seen so far. Very delicate. The town is also surrounded by a lot of gates. This one from the 1800s. And an earlier one from the 1500s. There's even a synagogue, a gorgeous building from 1899. Around that time, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a very large Jewish population in Brasov. In fact, throughout Romania, in many of the cities, there were at the time about 4,000 Jews in Brasov. And of course, we all know the history of the 20th century. And so today, there are only about 250 Jews left in the city, but they do have a still very active congregation. And they use this stunning synagogue that's tucked down this little alley with just the most exquisite architecture, very almost Byzantine style, which was typical at that time period. I just loved being able to stroll around the streets, particularly the pedestrian streets during the day, at night, and just looking at the little details. It's an absolutely beautiful town. This is a street called Rope Street and is supposedly the narrowest street in Europe, although I've been to a lot of places that claim to have the narrowest street in Europe, so I don't know who actually is right, but it is a fun place to stroll down because you can touch the walls on both sides. And here's an example of another one of the protective towers that originally surrounded the medieval city with walls. This one has obviously been very recently restored as part of a museum of the history of the city and of the fortifications. But there's several of the parts of the walls and fortification towers that you can still see. And that makes a nice walk as well. If you don't feel like going all the way up to the top of the hill, walking around the ramparts is a less strenuous way of still getting a very nice view over the old part of the town. Here's the original citadel, which was built just outside of the city walls to the north in the early 1500s, was used as a prison for a good long while, right up until the 20th century. Now it's a museum and a park and beautiful public park with a view of the city. Some more of the more recent late 19th, early 20th century buildings, including a lot of just stunning Art Nouveau. This one is like a Gothic revival wedding cake extravaganza. And I do want to take you to one place before we finish up, a very unusual place that not a lot of people necessarily go to, about half an hour north of Brasov, out in the plains. What I'm showing you here is, unfortunately, this was, I think, the third very serious car accident that we saw. Romania does have a fairly high, for European countries, does have a fairly high accident rate, although I wouldn't worry about that so much as a tourist, because most of it is because of people, often very young guys driving fast cars, often to show off or having had something to drink. And unfortunately, we saw some pretty bad accidents. But if you're driving defensively and minding your own business, you're probably going to be fine. But we had to take this unusual detour because the road was blocked off right after the accident had occurred, and they had everybody driving through the wheat fields to get around the accident because there was really nothing else to do. But the reason we were heading in that direction is to see this really unusual and just fantastic church town. It's hard to describe what it is, so I'll show you. This is a fortified church called Prejma. It was built in the 13th century by the Hungarian king, who authorized the Teutonic Knights. These, again, we're going back to all the Germans and the Saxons coming over from the West. He allowed them to build, the Hungarian king allowed them to build a church on this particular site. The Teutonic Knights later were kicked out, and it was taken over by the Cistercians. After the Reformation in the, what was that, the 1500s, it reverted to being Lutheran, and it remains that today. This is not my photograph, obviously. It's an aerial shot, but I needed to show you what it looks like from above so you can understand what kind of a structure it is. This is a very strong fortified church, again, designed to withstand sieges. Bear in mind that this town is out in the open on a very flat plain with no protection from anywhere. There's no hills, there's no rivers, there's no, it's a very vulnerable location. So they built a church and they completely surrounded it with this immense structure, which you can now visit. Mainly what they were protecting from was the Ottomans. And these fortifications provided housing for all of the village families. It was destroyed, the village, and by the village I mean everything outside of this structure, was destroyed 50 separate times over the centuries. But the church was never destroyed once. And what you're seeing here on the inside, what looks like a very rustic Holiday Inn is kind of the medieval version of that. The numbers designate different living apartments, and each family in the village was assigned a particular living space. And if there was if there was danger, if there was the threat of a siege, the entire community would stay in here in hopes of riding out the siege. It's been altered a little bit over the years and was very much restored in the 70s. But they did an excellent job, and it's one of the most fascinating things I saw in all of Romania. Just a completely unusual place, with the church in the middle, and a really nice triptych altarpiece, which is the oldest in all of Transylvania, that you can see here from the 15th century. Again, here's another example of a church that's full of Turkish carpets, donated by local families. And you can walk around all the battlements. You can explore all of these individual little apartments if you want. And around the top floor of that circular fortification are these galleries where they could shoot from and watch from. And you can explore those to your heart's content. It's a very photogenic place because it's just so unusual. Only one entrance, which was highly protected and easily defended, and then the fortified church in the middle. And here's a view from the outside with typical Romanian traffic. You can see how impregnable it is here. The tiny little windows around the top are that gallery that I was just showing you, where you can walk around. But that's really the only openings to the outside world, are the ones that are so high up. So I'm going to end the program there. And let me just take a quick look at the questions to see what I have missed. how can you recognize a Roma person? Um, that's that's a good question. Oh, let me stop my share. Um, you can and you can't. Certainly, as a foreigner who isn't as aware of all the little distinctions between people, it might be a little bit harder. But the Roma tend to have a particular style of dress that stands out. They those who have settled down and live in particular locations, housing, um, tend to opt for very brilliant colors. Some of their I have a different program on Romania where I have a couple of pictures of Roma houses out in the countryside that are just bizarre looking buildings. They could almost be Asian. Um, they look completely different. So you can kind of tell a little bit by the architecture. And many Roma have a slightly darker skin tone than the average Romanian. That's a bit of a generalization, but I think dress is probably the most obvious way for someone, like I said, for someone like us who just isn't as familiar with the intricacies of that society. I think you would probably notice them mostly by dress. How's the cuisine? I think I mentioned earlier, it's delicious, but it's heavy. It's a meat, potatoes, dumplings, root vegetables, great liquor. there's some plum brandy that they have there that's wonderful. But because, particularly if you're not in the cities, because it's so rural, you really do the farm to table concept that's become so popular here now is more of a way of life in Romania, because they still really do a lot of farming there, and much of it is very small scale. So particularly if you're out in the countryside, in small villages and towns, there's a lot of really delicious food that is going to be made from local farmers with produce and livestock and meats and so forth from their local farms. In fact, we stayed not in this part of the country, but in some of the other places we went. We stayed in a couple of farm stays, which was really nice because you're actually staying in a family on a working farm where there are animals and they cook you breakfast with the stuff from their farm. So if you have an opportunity to do that, I would definitely try that, because they're very inexpensive, and it's a way to connect a little bit with the locals more. We stayed in one place where they spoke not a word of English, and our Romanian was no good, but we managed. It was fine. And they were absolutely delightful and friendly, and boy, was the food good. Just like massive breakfasts, massive dinners, lots of soups and stews and vegetables and meats and so forth. Someone also asked about the dogs. Yes, they were stray dogs. The ones that were sleeping on the side of the dam. Yeah, those were strays. Although, again, if you're in the villages, many families have animals because they're on working farms. So there will be sheepdogs and sheep and family dogs and so forth. But the ones that you happen to see in that picture were strays. It looks remarkably clean. Yes and no. It's the kind of, I didn't see a lot of trash, I guess, if that's what you mean, not a lot of litter. Although in the big cities, you're going to see a certain amount of that just because it's a big city. In the rural countryside, yeah, I don't recall seeing very much litter at all. And there is pollution, as I mentioned, in some areas, although a lot of that's getting cleaned up. And most of the places I showed you tonight where you would be likely to travel as a tourist, there's just, you're really not going to be affected by that in the kind of places that that I was showing you this evening. Let me take a quick look through the chat as well as the Q&A. I'm not seeing any questions. Someone mentioned their coffee. Yes. They drink a lot of tea, a lot of the little strong Turkish coffee, because they are geographically close to the Ottoman Empire then and now. Modern Turkey, there is some of that influence in their food. They are another one of those countries that was kind of at the crossroads of a lot of different cultures. So they absorbed a lot of that in their architecture, their cuisine, and so forth.
Yeah, I was just very, very pleased by that coffee when I would get off the train early in the morning.
Yeah. I remember also there were some soups that we had, often with sausage or meat or sometimes vegetables, but there's a very sort of traditional soup that they make that has a little bit of vinegar in it that gives it a little kick, a little tang. That was a very traditional soup. That's one of those that isn't one recipe. You know, every grandmother has her own recipe of that soup, but we saw it in a lot of different places, and particularly if the weather had been a little rainy or a little cool, there's nothing nicer than having that really wonderful, hearty kind of food.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
But lots of fresh vegetables too.
Yeah, it's an amazing country. It's really, I think it's underestimated as far as people traveling there. I mean,
Very
like you were saying, like you think about it as being very Eastern European. I mean, it is Eastern European,
and it is,
but it's a big country. Like there's a lot of variety there, and I'm really excited to host your Bucharest. I'm excited to see what you have to say about Bucharest.
Yeah, I will mention about, we're doing that in December, I think, right? I will.
No, we're doing Budapest in December, but
Oh,
I
okay.
would like to do Bucharest at some point. Yeah.
Bucharest, I would say Bucharest is, it's not Paris.
No.
You can do Bucharest in probably 3 days. You'll see most of the stuff you want to see, but there's an amazing amount of stuff near it that that I include in that program that has that make for really nice, interesting day trip, beautiful ones, and also very historic things to see. I also have another program on the Maramuresh area, which we didn't touch on. That's the part way up in the extreme northwest. So if you think of Romania as like a clock, it's the part up like at 10, 11 o'clock up in the corner. It abuts, there's a river, but on the opposite side of the river is Ukraine. And it's probably the most traditional and rural part of the country, and it has a very distinctive style of architecture that's very different from the rest of the country, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So I did a separate program just on that because I found it so fascinating.
That would be really amazing. Then we could do a Romania series. Have you been to the Black Sea?
That was the one part of the country we didn't have time to get to.
We didn't have time to get there either. I know.
I would certainly like to. Yasha, and as you get up towards Moldova, there's and I'd like to go there too. There's some similar culture, and yeah, it looks beautiful.
Yeah. Well, you've got plenty of time, Jeff.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for an excellent presentation tonight. I did record this program. I will be sending it out to everybody tomorrow. And I do hope that you will look forward to Jeff coming back in December for Budapest. And I believe it's the first Wednesday again. We try to stick to that schedule if we can. And that is on Wednesday, December 7th.
And I also just put my email again into the chat. So if anyone, and you're welcome to share that later on. If anyone has questions that you think of later or that I didn't get to answer, or about this or anything else, I'm very happy to take your questions by email anytime.
Off the air. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. And
Thanks
thank you
everyone
Thanks
so much. Me.
Okay.
See you next time.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.